The old tree still stood. It rose from the valley floor the way certain things rise. Not with effort, not with announcement, but with the simple, indifferent permanence of something that has decided to outlast everything around it. Its trunk was wider than two men standing with arms outstretched. Its bark was furrowed deep as old wounds, spiraling in the slow, uneasy patterns that her father had taught her to read before she understood why she would ever need to. The hollow was warm. It had always been warm on the inside, in the way that things with deep roots and thick walls hold warmth, not by fighting what is cold, but by remembering what is not. A man stood before a group of workers on a pale winter morning, his hand pressed flat against a wall he had just finished building. The wall was not made of logs in the way walls were usually made in that valley. It was something different, layered, dense, calculated. He held his hand there long enough for everyone watching to understand that what he was feeling was not nothing. One of the younger men asked him where he had learned it. He did not answer immediately. He looked toward the valley, at the ancient cottonwood that stood at its far edge, visible even from this distance, even after all this time. "From a woman," he said finally, "that I called a fool." He turned back to the wall. "Watch the angle of the clay layer," he said, "and I'll tell you what I mean." Then the story began. Not here. Not with this man and his hand against a warm wall and the younger men watching. The story began the winter before, in the last hour of a fading afternoon, when a widow stood in the cold with her son beside her and understood that no door in the settlement would open for them tonight. She did not look back at the doors. She had learned, in the weeks since her husband's death, that looking back cost something she could not afford to spend. The foreman stood at the threshold of the company house, the house that had never truly been theirs, not in any way that mattered when it counted. He did not look at her when he spoke. He looked at the horizon, at the dark line where the pale sky met the frozen earth, as though the words he was saying were simply part of the landscape. "Your husband gave everything to this place," Harlan said. "So did the place. Debt settled." That was all. No cruelty in his voice, no pleasure, just the flat, final sound of an account being closed. The door shut behind him with a soft click that was somehow worse than a slam. Ilara Voss stood in the cold with her son beside her. 8 years old. Thin coat. One small bag between the two of them, packed with the things she had chosen to save when she understood that saving everything was no longer possible. Cale did not cry. That was the thing that frightened her most. He had not cried since the morning they told him about his father. He had simply gone somewhere inside himself, somewhere quiet and unreachable, and he had not fully come back. She watched for signs of him in there, a flicker of his old curiosity, the particular way he used to tilt his head when something interested him. And sometimes she found them, and sometimes she did not. He reached up and took her hand. She squeezed it once, twice, and then she turned away from the only shelter she had known in this part of the world, and she began to walk. The cold out on the open plain was not the cold of a single season. It was the cold of a place that had always been cold, would always be cold. A cold so deep and so old, it had become a kind of presence. It pressed against the skin, not like weather, but like intention. It found the gaps in her coat, the spaces at her wrists, the place where her scarf did not quite meet her collar. It was patient and thorough in the way that the indifferent world is patient and thorough, without malice, and therefore without mercy. Beside her, Kale walked without complaint. A dog would have whimpered. A grown man might have cursed. Her son simply walked, his small boots punching holes in the crust of old snow, his breath making small clouds in the air that disappeared before they had a chance to become anything at all. She watched his breath disappear and thought about her husband, who had always said that Cadil had her eyes and his stubbornness, and that this was the best possible combination. She had argued with him about the stubbornness part. She was not arguing now. She did not yet know where they were going, and then she did. The memory came not as a thought, but as a sensation. The smell of pine resin and turned earth, the weight of her father's hand on her shoulder, his voice low and certain in the way that her father's voice had always been certain. A tree can live 100 years with a hollow heart, he had told her once. She had been perhaps 6 years old, standing in a forest so different from this one, green and ancient, not pale and frozen. The loggers call it rot. They call it worthless. He had paused then, the way he always paused before the part that mattered. But a hollow can be a shelter, little one, if you know how to read it. He had taught her the signs, the way the bark grew in slow, uneasy spirals, as though the tree were trying to twist itself away from something. The shelf fungi that grew like small wooden stairs, climbing nothing, announcing to anyone who understood the announcement that the wood inside had already begun its transformation. The sound, deep, resonant, almost musical, that a hollow trunk made when struck. So different from the solid thud of living wood. She had not thought of those lessons in years. She thought of them now. There was a tree. She had seen it only once, weeks ago, while gathering what wood she could from the edge of the valley. A cottonwood so vast it seemed less like a tree and more like a feature of the earth itself, something that had grown there the way mountains grow, slowly and without apology. Its trunk was wider than she was tall. The loggers had ignored it. Too large to fell cleanly. Too old to mill into anything useful. It stood at the far edge of the valley, sheltered on 3 sides by the rise of the land. She turned toward it now. The walk took the better part of an hour. The light was failing fast, the sky going from bruised purple to the specific dark blue that meant serious cold was coming. The kind that did not negotiate. Kale walked beside her the whole way, without asking where they were going, without asking anything at all. She was grateful for this in a way she could not have explained without weeping, so she said nothing, and he said nothing, and they walked together through the failing light toward the tree she had only seen once, but had not, it turned out, forgotten. When she finally saw it, massive, gnarled, ancient against the fading sky, something in her chest loosened slightly. She had not known until that moment how tightly she had been holding the possibility that she had remembered wrong, that the tree would not be there, or would not be what she needed it to be. She breathed out, and the breath turned to vapor and vanished, and she thought, "We are here." She circled the base slowly, her mittened hands brushing along the bark, reading it the way her father had taught her to read. The spiraling growth, the shelf fungi, brittle now in the cold, but unmistakable. And when she pressed her palm flat against the trunk and listened, really listened, the way her father had taught her by example, by standing silent before trees himself, until she understood that silence was a form of attention. Yes, there, the faint hollow resonance beneath. A sound like a room with nothing in it. A sound like potential. On the leeward side, half hidden behind a tangle of dead brush that rattled in the wind, she found the gap. A long vertical fissure in the bark, barely wider than her shoulders, shaped by the slow patient work of decades of expanding and contracting in the cold. She pulled the brush away with cold hands. Darkness inside, stillness, and rising from that stillness, barely perceptible but undeniably present, warmth. Not the warmth of fire, the warmth of depth, of mass, of something that had been quietly holding heat the way certain people hold their feelings, privately, stubbornly, for a very long time. She squeezed through the gap. The world changed. The wind, which had been pressing against her with the steady insistence of something that wants something from you, dropped to a distant murmur. The hard edge of the cold softened into something more neutral, more patient. Inside the hollow of the ancient tree, the air was still, not warm exactly, but not the killing cold of outside. It smelled of old wood and damp earth, and something underneath that she had no word for. Something that had been waiting here for a long time, and was not surprised to have a visitor at last. She looked at the curved interior walls, fibrous, thick, the wood gone soft with age in places, solid in others. The floor was uneven but workable, the kind of uneven that can be leveled rather than the kind that cannot be addressed. She stood and turned slowly, taking in what was there, what the tree had to offer, and what it would need from her in exchange. And then she saw it, carved into the wood of the interior wall, at roughly shoulder height, worn soft with time, but still legible, EV, and beneath it 2 words. One winter, Ilara stood very still, her family name, her father's initials, carved into this tree in what must have been, by the depth of the weathering, a very long time ago. Decades, certainly. Perhaps more. She reached out and touched the letters. They were smooth under her fingertips, worn by years, and the slight dampness of the living wood. Her father's hand had made these marks. He had stood in this exact darkness and had not been afraid of it. He had stood here and done what he always did when he understood something important. He left a record. He had been here, before her, long before her. And he had known, somehow, impossibly, in the way that certain people seem to know things that logic cannot entirely account for, that she might need to find him here. At the base of the wall, barely visible beneath a layer of old wood dust and debris, something caught the last thin thread of light from the entrance. She knelt. A tin box, small, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth tied with cord that had gone stiff with age. She lifted it carefully, the way she might lift something sleeping. It was heavier than she expected. Whatever was inside had been chosen with care. She did not open it. Not yet. Behind her, Cale squeezed through the entrance and stood beside her. She felt him looking at the space, at the curved walls, the quiet, the strange and unlikely shelter of it. She felt him trying to understand what he was looking at and arriving, gradually, at the beginning of understanding. Can we really live here, Mama? She looked at the initials on the wall, at the box in her hands, at her son's face, pale and attentive in the dim light, waiting for an answer she did not yet fully have, but was beginning, already, to construct. Your grandfather did, she said. Cale looked around again, more slowly this time, with the particular deliberateness of a child who has decided to take something seriously. He was looking for what she saw. She let him look. In the far corner, a small shape detached itself from the shadows. Kale startled, then leaned forward. A dog, thin as winter itself. Ribs visible beneath a coat gone dull and matted, the coat of an animal that had been surviving rather than living for some time. It had found the gap before they had crept inside for the same reason any living thing creeps into a dark, warm space: survival. It looked at them with the patient, uncertain eyes of something that has been disappointed before, but has not yet stopped hoping. There was a question in its posture that was also a kind of offer. I am here. I will not trouble you. But if there is room for me in whatever you are building, I would like to stay. Kale looked up at his mother. She looked at the dog, at her son, at the hollow dark around them, which was not frightening, she realized. Not frightening at all. The darkness here was a different quality from the darkness outside. It was contained, sheltered, the darkness of a held space, rather than the darkness of open night. It was quiet. It was theirs. This is our home, she said. And somewhere in the wall behind her, in the deep, fibrous heart of the ancient tree, something that had been cold for a very long time began, slowly, to remember how to hold warmth. The first night inside the tree, Ilara did not sleep. She sat with her back against the curved interior wall. Kale curled against her side beneath every layer of clothing she had brought. The thin dog pressed against his legs for warmth that went both ways. She listened to the wind moving around the outside of the trunk, not through it, around it, the way water moves around a stone in a river. The tree did not shake, did not creak with the anxious complaint of a structure uncertain of its own integrity. It simply stood the way it had stood for longer than anyone in the valley could remember, absorbing the cold the way old things absorb everything. Quietly, without complaint, without being changed by it in any way that mattered. She held the tin box in her lap. She did not open it that night. Something told her she was not ready yet, that she needed to earn the opening of it, that she needed to understand first where she was and what she had to work with. Both what the space offered and what her own resources were counted honestly, without either despair or false optimism. What she had: one axe, its handle worn smooth from her husband's hand in a way that made it feel familiar, even though it was too large for her grip. A small hand saw, a tinderbox that had gotten wet during the walk and would need to dry before it was useful, perhaps 2 days, perhaps 3. A bedroll, wool, thick enough. Half a sack of dried corn, a strip of salted meat, the last of what had been in the house, a knife, the tools from her husband's kit, a few basic things she had grabbed in the last minutes, not knowing exactly why, acting on some instinct older than thought, the instinct that says, take what can be used, even if you cannot yet imagine the using. What she did not have: fire, any certainty about tomorrow, any plan beyond the next few hours. She looked at Kale sleeping. His face in rest was the face of a younger child, the soft, unguarded face of a boy who still believed the world was mostly safe, or who at least had found a way to believe it while he slept. She watched his chest rise and fall. She listened to the dog breathing, a slow and comfortable sound, the sound of an animal that has found warmth and settled into it completely. Outside, the wind continued its long conversation with itself. She thought about her father's hands, wide, calloused, smelling always of pine resin and something mineral she had never been able to name. The way he moved through forests, slowly, reading everything. The way he would press his palm to a trunk and close his eyes as though the tree were telling him something, and he was simply being polite enough to listen. He had taught her that wood was not just material. It was memory. A record of every winter the tree had survived, every drought, every wound. He had taught her that the hollow was not a failure of the tree, but an adaptation. The tree shedding what it no longer needed, the better to endure. She had been 12 when he taught her that. She had not known then that she was being given something she would one day need to survive. She thought, the tinderbox needs to dry. The floor needs to be leveled and insulated. The entrance needs a door, not to lock anything out, but to keep the warmth from bleeding away each time the wind shifted. The walls need a lining of clay, packed thick, to hold the heat once she had heat to hold. And she needed to find the clay, which meant she needed to know where the stream was, which meant tomorrow she would walk the valley perimeter before the light failed and make a map in her mind of what was available and where. One thing at a time. One thing at a time was how you survived a problem too large to look at all at once. She slept finally in the hour before dawn, with the tin box still in her lap and her son's warmth against her side, and the ancient tree breathing slowly around them all. The tinderbox, dried by the second morning, laid near the faint warmth that rose from the deep earth floor of the hollow. A warmth so subtle she felt it first through her knees when she knelt, and then through her palms, and understood that the ground itself was warmer than the air, that the deep earth below the frost line held a steady temperature that the surface, cold, could not reach. Her father had taught her this too, though she had forgotten until her palms remembered. But dried was not the same as working. The flint struck sparks that died in the air, too faint, too brief, swallowed by the cold before they could find anything to hold. Ilara tried for a long time. She did not let Kale see how many times she tried. She sent him out to gather the driest material he could find, dead grass from beneath the snow's crust, the underside of fallen bark, thin shavings of the softest wood. He brought back what he could with small, deliberate hands, and she thanked him and sent him back for more, while she crouched in the dim interior and struck the flint again and again. By the third day, they had not had a real fire. Kale had eaten the last of the dried corn the night before. Ilara had told him she wasn't hungry. It was not entirely a lie. Hunger and fear had a way of crowding each other out, each one making the other harder to locate. But the hunger was there. She could feel it in the way her hands trembled slightly when she struck the flint, a fine trembling that had nothing to do with cold. She had told her husband once, in a lighter time, that she had inherited her father's stubbornness along with his eyes. He had laughed and said that was why he'd married her. She thought of that now, crouching in the cold, and she let herself feel it for exactly 3 seconds. The weight of missing him, the specific, physical ache of it, the way grief is so often located in the body rather than the mind. And then she picked up the flint again. Her father's voice came to her not as memory, but as something more immediate. The way certain voices live in the body rather than the mind, accessible not through recollection, but through a kind of interior listening. Not the tinderbox, the stones. She had been looking at the problem wrong. The tinderbox mechanism was too cold, too damp in its working parts, too compromised by the journey through the snow. But the valley had a stream, even now running beneath its skin of ice, and riverbeds held flint. True flint, dense and dry at its core, untouched by the surface moisture that had ruined her box. The stream would give her what she needed if she could find it, and if she could work carefully enough on the ice. She left Kale inside with the dog and went to the stream. The ice was thick at the edges, but thinner in the middle where the current ran. Beneath the ice along the bank, she found what she needed. Dark stones, smooth on the outside, brittle at the edge. She broke two against each other, listening for the sound her father had described. A sharp, glassy crack. There, she brought them back. She knelt on the floor of the hollow and built a nest of the finest material she had. The dried grass Kale had gathered, sorted now by fineness, the finest at the center. The thin bark shavings, fibers teased from the inside of a piece of old rope she'd found in her husband's kit. A skill her father had shown her once that she had not used in 20 years, and found she had not forgotten. She held the stones close to the nest. She struck them together at the angle her father had shown her, low and sharp, angled like a slice rather than a pound. The way you approach something you want to open rather than something you want to destroy. The sparks that leaped from the stones on the first several strikes were small, scattered, lost in the cold air before they reached the nest. She adjusted her angle. She struck again. The spark on the 19th strike was different, larger, more committed. It leaped from the stone with a quality of intention, a small orange point of pure will, and it landed in the center of the nest where the finest fibers were. And it held. She felt rather than saw the moment it caught. A slight warming near her face, a change in the quality of the air. She leaned down and blew the softest breath she could. The breath of someone who has understood that this moment requires restraint more than force. The nest caught. The fire, small and tentative and entirely real, began to burn. Kale was sitting very still across the hollow, watching. He had not made a sound through the whole process, had not offered encouragement or expressed doubt, had simply watched with the attention of a child who understands that some things require the person doing them to be left alone to do them. When the flame took hold and she sat back, he let out a breath she suspected he had been holding for most of 3 days. He almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him since the world had changed. It was small and uncertain and reached only partway across his face before it stopped, as though the muscles responsible had forgotten the full range of motion and were relearning. But it was there. She saw it. She held it in her memory like the fire itself. Something small and real and hard-won. She thought, the earth never forgets what it has been taught. Her father had taught her something, years ago in a different kind of cold. And here, in this hollow, that teaching was bearing fruit in the 19th attempt on the 3rd day. She fed the fire with care. Small pieces first, patient. Her father had always said that a new fire needed to be earned, not demanded. That you built trust with a fire the way you built trust with anything, through consistent small acts, rather than one large one. The earth never forgets what it has been taught. That was the first time she said it. It would not be the last. Over the days that followed, she built, not quickly, not with the certainty she would later be told she seemed to have. She built the way all real building happens, with mistakes and corrections and the slow accumulation of understanding that is so gradual you barely notice it until the day you look up and see that what was once nothing has become something. The floor first. She dug out the damp, rotted wood pulp that carpeted the hollow's base, hauling it out in the bucket she'd fashioned from a folded piece of bark and her husband's old leather tool bag. Her back ached, her hands blistered, and then the blisters hardened and became hands that could work without bleeding. Below the damp layer, the ground was drier, dense and interwoven with roots, solid as packed earth anywhere. She lined it with flat stones she carried from the stream bed, many trips, her arms burning with the weight. On top of the stones, she laid pine boughs, thick and overlapping, the way her father had taught her to thatch a shelter roof. The floor became firm, dry, real. Then the walls. She found clay along the lower bank of the stream where the ground never fully froze. The earth stayed soft there, sheltered by the overhang of the bank and warmed, she suspected, by the same underground currents that kept the stream alive through the deepest cold. The clay was stiff and resistant, as clay always is, but it warmed against her body and became workable, and she packed it against the inner wall of the hollow in layers, smoothing each layer before adding the next. Her father had taught her that clay held heat the way certain people hold what they've been given, slowly, deeply, with a reluctance to release it that was not stubbornness, but simply the nature of density. A clay-lined wall, once warm, stayed warm long after the fire went low. She built a small hearth from stacked stones, and she built a flue, a narrow channel of clay and stone that snaked upward through a natural crevice in the trunk and vented well above the roofline, drawing the smoke up and out without revealing to any casual observer that anything inside this supposedly worthless old tree was alive and burning. Cale watched all of this with attentive eyes. On the third day of building, he brought her a flat stone, wider than his two hands spread together, smooth on one side, with a slight natural hollow that made it easy to hold. "For my lessons," he said. She had to turn away. She stood facing the wall for a moment, one hand pressed against the clay she had just smoothed, feeling the faint warmth already beginning to build in it, like a promise. She breathed slowly. She had made herself a rule about crying. She would do it when he was asleep, and not before, because a mother's fear is contagious, and she refused to infect him with hers when what he needed from her was steadiness. But the stone, the fact that in the middle of all this, in the cold and the uncertainty and the exhaustion and the grief that neither of them had yet found the right way to speak about, her son had thought about his lessons, had gone looking for a stone that would work for writing on, had found one and brought it to her because he understood that learning was not a luxury, but a continuation of normal life, and that normal life, conducted in abnormal circumstances, was itself a form of resistance. She composed herself. She turned back. "That's a good stone," she said. "We'll use it every day." He nodded once, with the gravity of a child entering a contract. And they had. It was on a clear morning, when the cold had temporarily relented to the degree that breathing did not hurt, that Silas Webb came. She heard him before she saw him, heavy footsteps in the snow, the sound of a large man who has moved through the world for many years with the confidence of someone who knows his right to be where he is and has never had occasion to question it. She was outside the hollow, working on the clay chinking for the flue's upper section where a gap she'd noticed was allowing cold air to infiltrate, when he appeared at the edge of the tree line and stood looking at her and at the tree with an expression she couldn't quite read from a distance. He was the largest man in the settlement, not only in frame, but in the space his certainty occupied in any room he entered. He had built half the structures in the valley himself and supervised the building of the other half. He knew wood. He knew cold. He knew what shelter required. His opinion about these things was not an opinion in the usual sense. It was simply fact. He looked at the hollow. He looked at her. He looked at the thin curl of smoke rising from a point in the bark well above the entrance, barely visible, nothing more than a shimmer in the cold air. Something moved across his face that she could not name. "You're building your coffin," he said finally. "Not your home." She kept working, pressing clay into the gap and smoothing it with the flat of her thumb. "The damp will get into your lungs before spring," he said. "The weight of the wood above will come down in the first real storm. The rot that hollowed this tree is still active. The whole thing could split." He delivered this inventory of disasters with the calm authority of a man reciting facts he has personally verified. "You don't know what you're doing." She smoothed a section of clay, pressing firmly into the gap, feeling the way the clay gave and then held. "This is madness," he said. "When it kills you, it'll be the town that has to come out here and deal with it. Men risking themselves in cold weather for a woman who wouldn't listen to reason." She looked up at him then, just for a moment. "Then I suppose," she said, "the town will know where to find us." He stood there another moment, looking at her with the particular frustration of a man who has just deployed what he considers his best argument and watched it have no effect. Then he turned and walked back toward the town, his footprints deep and certain in the snow. She went back to her work. She heard later, through the particular silence that falls over a place when it is talking about you, the silence of conversations that stop when you enter a room and resume when you leave, that he had given her project a name. He'd said it at the general store, where men gathered in the mornings over coffee and the comfortable certainty of things they already believed. And the name had spread the way those things always spread, faster than fire, sticking to everything it touched. Voss's Folly. Cale heard the name first from a boy whose father was a miner. A boy who had said it with the particular cruelty that children achieve only when faithfully repeating what they have heard from adults, when they have been given the words without the responsibility that should accompany them. Cale came back to the hollow that afternoon and told his mother what the boy had said. He told her the whole thing without embellishment, standing in the entrance with his flat stone under his arm, his expression carefully neutral in the way of someone who has decided that neutrality is the appropriate response to a situation whose correct emotional register he has not yet worked out. She was lining the second section of the inner wall and listened without stopping her work. "What did you say to him?" she asked. "Nothing," Cale said. He paused. "I didn't know what to say." She pressed clay into a gap, smoothing it carefully, feeling the slight resistance, and then the give. "That was the right answer," she said. "You don't argue with someone who's borrowing their opinion from someone else. You wait." "Wait for what?" She looked at him. At the stone he carried everywhere now, tucked under his arm like something of value, which it was. "For the truth to become obvious," she said. He thought about this. Then he came inside and set the stone on the ledge she had made for it, and began his afternoon's lessons. It was the dog who found Berta first, or perhaps it was Berta who found the dog. The truth was probably that they found each other, the way things that understand what they are looking for sometimes find it by proximity rather than search, by being in the right place with the right kind of attention. Ilara heard the sound early one morning, before the light had fully decided what it was going to do with the day, too deliberate for wind, too soft for an animal moving with any urgency, and stepped outside to find a small wrapped bundle at the entrance to the hollow. A cloth package, set down with care, placed on the one flat stone near the entrance that wouldn't tip it over. Inside, a twist of dried oats, a small piece of hard cheese gone dry at the edges, a handful of wrinkled dried apples that had been stored well through the fall. No note, no name. She looked around. The snow showed tracks. The shuffling, careful tracks of an older person who moved slowly but with clear purpose, who knew where they were going before they started. She didn't know the tracks then. She would know them later. She stood holding the bundle in the cold morning and felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel. The warmth of being seen. Not helped exactly. Not rescued. Seen. The acknowledgement that she existed and that her existing mattered to someone, even if that someone had not stayed to be thanked. She went back inside and told Cale that someone had left them breakfast. He looked at the dried apples as though they were something extraordinary, which, in the context of that morning, they were. The dog lay in the corner watching with patient eyes. "Flint," Cale said suddenly. She looked at him. "His name is Flint." He looked at the dog, then at her, then back. "Because of the stones. The ones you used to start the fire." She looked at the dog. The dog looked back at her with the calm expression of an animal who has already decided the question is settled, whatever she says. "Flint," she said. Flint thumped his tail once on the clay floor. It was decided. On a morning shortly after the bundle of food appeared, Ilara was outside widening the earth berm she had begun to pack around the base of the tree on the north-facing side, building up the insulation at ground level where the cold entered most efficiently. When she heard different footsteps in the snow, lighter than Silas Webb's, more deliberate, more measured, the footsteps of someone who was thinking about something as they walked. The woman who appeared from the direction of the town was perhaps 60, with the careful, upright posture of someone who had once been taller and had made a conscious decision not to let the years take more than they'd already claimed. Her face was lined in the way that comes from outdoor living over many decades, from weather and squinting into light, and the particular way that cold works on skin when you've spent most of your life in it. She had the clarity in her eyes that Ilara associated with people who have survived things, not just endured them, but survived them in the specific sense of coming through with something intact that mattered. She stood at a slight distance and looked at what Ilara had built. She did not say it was foolish. She did not say it was impressive. She looked at it the way a craftsperson looks at another person's work, for what it is, not for what it isn't. "Your berm," she said finally. "It wants to be thicker on the east side. The wind here doesn't always come from where you'd expect. There's a draw in the ridge that funnels it from the northeast in the worst storms. You want coverage there." Ilara straightened up. "You've done this before," she said. "My grandmother built into a hillside," Berta said. "In the old country, walls 4 feet thick. They called it a house. We called it warm." She paused in the way of someone giving a point time to land. The principle doesn't change with the material. She did not offer her help. She simply stood there, in the way of a person who is available if you have sense enough to ask. Ilara had sense enough. "Show me," she said. Berta showed her. They worked together for 2 hours without talking much. Berta showed her how to angle the berm so it deflected rather than simply blocked, how to interleave layers of different materials for stability, how to read the surface of the snow to understand where the wind had been working. When Berta left, she went without ceremony, the way she had arrived. She did not tell Ilara her name until the 4th visit. Ilara did not ask. Some things establish themselves in their own time. The hollow was becoming something. The transformation was gradual enough that Alara almost missed the individual steps of it. But then she would come back from outside after an hour of work and walk through the entrance and feel it. The way the air inside was different from the air outside, not just in temperature, but in quality. Settled, inhabited, the air of a place that has been breathed in and breathed out by people who belong there. The clay walls were complete now, covering the interior from floor to well above head height, smooth and dense. Already she could feel the difference in how the space responded to the fire. The temperature no longer plummeted the moment the fire went low. It lagged. It resisted. When the cold deepened at night, the hollow held, stubbornly, steadily, to the warmth that had been pressed into the clay hour by hour over many days, the way a stone in a summer field holds the heat of the sun long after the sun has moved on. She understood what her father had been telling her all those years ago. A wall that stores heat is not the same as a wall that blocks cold. Blocking cold is a war. Storing heat is a strategy. She had stopped fighting the winter. She was learning to work with it. Cale did his lessons every day on the flat stone. She taught him figures and letters and the names of things, using whatever she had. A stick in the clay floor, a finger in the frost on the outer bark, words said aloud and repeated back until they were fixed. He was unhurried about the work, approaching each new thing with the same deliberate attention he brought to everything now. But he was learning. She could see it in the way he engaged with the flat stone, the way he would sit with a problem after she presented it, turning it over, not rushing toward an answer, but taking time to understand the question first. One afternoon, she came inside to find him showing Flint something on the flat stone. He was running his finger along letters he had scratched there, speaking softly, as though reading aloud to an attentive audience that deserved to be taken seriously. Flint was listening with every appearance of sincere interest, his head tilted at the precise angle of an animal who has decided that the sounds being made are important and is concentrating on understanding them. She stood in the entrance and did not make a sound. Some things need to be left alone in the moment they exist, because naming them or acknowledging them changes them into something slightly different. And what they are right now is already right. The threat came without warning, the way such things always do. With the bureaucratic abruptness of a system that has no mechanism for considering the specific circumstances of specific people, only for applying general rules to general categories. A man she had not seen before arrived at the hollow on a gray morning, coming from a direction that was neither the town nor the valley trail, carrying with him the particular authority of someone who represents something larger than himself. He was not unpleasant. He was not cruel. He was something more difficult than either of those. He was official. He had papers. She did not need to read all of them to understand the essential point. The land she occupied did not fall within the boundaries of any recognized claim. This collective non-ownership had been interpreted somewhere above her head in the architecture of territorial governance as a reason to remove unauthorized habitation. The removal was not personal. It was procedural. She had 14 days. If she had not vacated the premises by the end of that period, arrangements would be made for her dependent, for Cale. The man said this with the particular care of someone who has learned, through experience, that this is the part of the message that requires the most careful delivery, who has learned that people will absorb most bad news with some equanimity, but that this specific piece of information, the part about children, lands differently than the rest. He left. She stood in the entrance of the hollow for a long time after, Flint pressed against her leg, the cold pressed against her back. She stood between them and felt the particular stillness of someone who has been given a problem that cannot be solved by any of the tools she currently has in her hands. That night, after Cale was asleep, she sat alone near the fire with the tin box still closed in her lap and one of the few pieces of flat paper she owned. She had been thinking, in the long dark hours since supper, about contingency, about what she would do if she lost, not about how to win. That conversation with herself could wait until she understood the shape of the problem better. First, she needed to think about what losing meant concretely in terms of the life of a specific 8-year-old boy. She began to write a letter. She addressed it to Silas Webb. She did not like Silas Webb. She was not certain he was a good man in the way that word is used when it means something specific and morally substantive. But he was, without question, a man of weight in the community. A man the settlement respected. A man whose word carried force. A man who would not be easily dismissed by officials with papers and the board authority of bureaucratic procedure. She wrote carefully. She asked him, if it came to that, if she exhausted every other option before the 14 days ended, to see to it that Cale was not sent to the institution on the eastern side of the territory, that Cale stayed somewhere in the valley, that someone who understood this land, who knew what winter meant here and what a child needed to survive it, looked after him until he could look after himself. She had written perhaps a third of the letter when she heard Cale shift behind her. She stilled. He had turned over in his sleep. He was looking at her, not fully awake, but not asleep either, inhabiting that threshold state that children enter when the day has given them more than they've been able to process, and the sleep is doing the processing for them. "Are you sending me away?" he said. His voice was small, careful, the voice of a child who has learned in recent weeks that the world is larger and less manageable than he had previously understood, and who has adjusted his relationship to it accordingly. Asking questions he needs answered, rather than the questions he would prefer to ask. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she folded the letter in half. She held it over the low fire and let it catch. She held it until the flame reached her fingers, and she had to let go. And she watched the last of it turn to ash on the hearthstones. The ash pale against the darker stone, already cooling. "No," she said, "never." He watched the ash for a moment. Then he closed his eyes and went back to sleep. She sat in the dark after that and did not write any more letters. What she felt was not courage, exactly. Courage was a thing you chose. What she felt was something older and simpler than choice. The absolute, cellular refusal of a mother's body to accept the alternative, whatever it cost, whatever came next. She picked up the tin box. She had earned the opening of it. The lid was stiff. The oilcloth seal had kept out the moisture but made the hinge reluctant. She worked it carefully, patient, the way she had been learning to be patient with things that did not want to give way. Inside, a small journal, bound in leather that had softened with age to something that felt almost like cloth. Her father's handwriting on the first page, close and economical, the handwriting of a man who had spent decades writing in the margins of time and had never formed the habit of excess. She turned pages in the firelight. He had written about the tree, about the winter he had spent inside it, young, alone, in circumstances he described in sparse practical terms that nonetheless told her more about what he had felt than elaboration would have. He had been 23. He had been mapping survey lines for the Territorial Authority and had been caught by an early storm. A storm that arrived weeks before anyone expected it, that caught him 5 miles from shelter, that he survived by finding the cottonwood and understanding what it offered. He had been learning too, just as she was learning. He had experimented with the clay lining and gotten it partially right, not knowing then what she had come to understand more fully by building on his beginning. His notes were the record of a man thinking in real time, catching himself in wrong assumptions and correcting them, trying again. She read on. Near the back of the journal, the entries changed, became less personal, more observational. He had written about patterns, the way the oldest residents of the valley spoke about winter, the particular winters that came down through the stories like landmarks, the ones that came once in a generation and reshaped everything. He had written about the signs that preceded them, the birds, the pressure, the particular flat quality of the light in the weeks before, as though the sky were hoarding something. And then, at the bottom of the last filled page, in handwriting slightly different from the rest, written, she thought, at a different time, with different ink, perhaps much later in his life, a single paragraph, densely written, every word chosen. She read it twice. Then she sat with it for a long while, the journal open in her lap, the fire burning low, the tree breathing quietly around her, the sound of Kale sleeping behind her steady and even and real. Her father had known. He had known the way a man knows who has spent his whole life paying attention to the world instead of his own reflection in it. He had known a storm was coming. He had left her everything she needed to survive it. She looked at the last line he had written. Not an observation, not a data point, but something directed. Something that had been waiting inside this box, inside this tree, inside this valley, for her to be ready to receive it. She closed the journal. She sat with the tin box open in her lap and thought about her father and the tree and the clay walls, and her son asleep behind her, and the 14 days that were now 13, and the fire burning low, and the storm her father had described, which was not, she now understood, a theoretical future possibility. It was coming. It might already be on its way, and she was the only person in this valley who knew. Outside, the wind moved around the great trunk of the cottonwood in its old familiar way, patient, unhurried, the way it had always moved and the way it would always move, long after she and everyone she knew was gone. The earth never forgets what it has been taught. She had a great deal of work to do. The morning after she read her father's journal, Alara went to town. She went because the journal had told her something important, and she could not in good conscience keep it entirely to herself. But first she stood at the entrance of the hollow in the gray morning light and looked at what had become, against all reasonable expectation, her home. The berm on the north and east sides was thick and well angled now, built the way Berta had shown her to build it, deflecting the worst of the wind rather than simply presenting a surface for it to push against. The entrance door, woven from willow branches and packed with sod, sealed the gap with a reliability that still surprised her when she tested it. The clay-lined interior held warmth through the night with the fire at barely a quarter of what she'd needed in the first days. She slept without her coat most nights now, a fact that still felt like a small miracle every morning when she woke and registered her own warmth. Flint sat beside her, his breath making small, patient clouds. He had appointed himself her shadow some weeks ago, his schedule adjusted entirely to hers, his presence at her side so consistent that she had stopped noticing it except in the moments when he wasn't there, when his absence registered as a specific kind of incompleteness. She looked at the barometer, the small brass instrument her father had kept all his working life, stored in the tin box beneath the journal like a second letter, a letter written in numbers rather than words. The needle had been moving for 3 days. The slow, deliberate decline of something that knows where it is going. She went to town. Berta was not at her door when Alara knocked. Her husband answered, a man shorter than Berta, with the wary eyes of someone who has spent a long time managing something he doesn't fully understand and has developed wariness as a general policy in response. He looked at Alara the way the town had been looking at her for weeks, with a particular mixture of pity and mild embarrassment. The expression of someone who finds another person's situation socially awkward and cannot quite decide whether to acknowledge the awkwardness or pretend it isn't there. Berta isn't available, he said. I need to speak with her. It's important. Something shifted in his expression. The resolute blankness of a man who has made a decision and will not be moved from it, because being moved from it would require him to engage with the possibility that the decision was wrong, which is a more uncomfortable position than simply holding the line. She isn't available, he said again, with the particular firmness of a person repeating themselves as a substitute for argument. He closed the door. Alara stood on the step for a moment. The cold pressed at her back. She thought about knocking again. Thought about what she would say if he opened the door a second time. Thought about Berta somewhere inside that house, probably aware of the knock and the conversation, probably unable to come to the door for reasons that had nothing to do with Alara and everything to do with the complex arrangements of domestic authority in that particular household. She turned and walked to the next house, and the next, and the one after that. She went to every house in the settlement. She explained what she had read, the patterns, the signs, the conclusion. She showed the barometer to the 3 people who let her far enough inside to show it. She was careful with her words. She was not careful enough. At the general store, a small gathering of men had collected near the iron stove in the way that men in small settlements collected in cold weather. The shared warmth making proximity comfortable, the shared certainty making it pleasurable. Silas Webb was among them. He was always among them. He was the kind of man around whom other men arranged themselves without being directed to do so, a center of gravity that had never thought to question its own pull. Alara told them what she had told the others. She kept her voice level. She laid the information out the way you lay stones for a foundation, methodically, each piece supporting the next. When she finished, there was a silence. Then Silas Webb set down his coffee cup on the counter with a sound that was not quite a slam, but carried the intention of one. "Go back to your tree, woman," he said. "Leave the weather to God and the men who understand it." He was looking at the other men when he said it, pitched perfectly for the room, managing the group by managing his own apparent feeling. The room eased. Alara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her father's journal, about the community he had warned, about what had happened to the ones who had stayed inside their sturdy, confident, utterly inadequate houses. She thought, "Some of these men have children." She said, "I hope you're right." She walked back out into the cold. Callum Hare arrived that same afternoon, while the light was still gray and the temperature had begun its daily descent toward the worst of the night cold. His footsteps were different from the ones she had learned to identify. Not the heavy certainty of Silas Webb, not the shuffling care of Berta's approach, not the official deliberateness of the man with papers. These were the footsteps of someone moving with purpose, but with awareness that the purpose might not be welcome, who had decided to arrive anyway and deal with the reception when it came. He was younger than she had expected a lawyer to be, younger than she had imagined. When Berta's note leaving and Berta's occasional glances that said more than her words had suggested someone was working on the land question. He was lean in the way of someone who forgets to eat when preoccupied, who is too often preoccupied. He had the face of a person whose default mode is listening, which is rarer than it should be. He told her who he was. He told her Berta had sent word to him some weeks ago, before Berta's husband had closed that particular door, and that he had been working on the question of the land. He had been delayed, he said. The roads between settlements had been difficult for much of the season. She waited. He told her what he had found. The land she occupied fell within a surveyed corridor that predated the current system of territorial claims by decades. The official who had come with his papers had overreached. The order to vacate had no legal foundation. Cale was not going anywhere. She stood with this for a moment. Let it settle. Good news sometimes takes longer to become real than bad news, because bad news arrives with its own momentum, and good news requires you to actually believe it. Why are you helping us? She said. He was quiet for a moment, the quiet of someone deciding how much of a true answer to give. My wife died 3 winters ago, he said. Fever. There was someone in the next settlement who had experience with it, who might have made a difference if they'd been reached in time. No one went. There were reasons why no one went. He paused. There are always reasons. He looked at Cale, who was sitting near the hollow's entrance with Flint, both of them watching this unfamiliar man with the careful attention of creatures who have learned that the arrival of someone new is information that should be processed before trust is extended. I don't want to be someone who had reasons, Callum said, when I could prevent it. Ilara looked at him for a long moment. He met her eyes steadily. He was not asking for anything. He was simply there, outside the entrance to a home that most of the valley considered madness, offering what he had. Come back tomorrow, she said. There's something I need to tell you about what's coming. He nodded once and left. She watched him go. Then she looked at Cale. He looks like he means it, Cale said. He said this with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to soften observations. People often do, she said. Do you believe him? She was quiet for a moment. I think I believe Berta, she said. And Berta sent him. Cale considered this the way he considered most things, fully, from multiple angles, without rushing to a conclusion before the thinking was done. Then he returned to his flat stone with the careful attention of someone who has processed enough for one afternoon and knows to stop before capacity is reached. Flint put his head in Cale's lap. The afternoon deepened around them. That night, Ilara did not sleep well. She lay in the warmth of the hollow and listened to the tree. There was a sound the cottonwood made in certain winds. Not a creak, which would have suggested structural anxiety, but something deeper and more resonant. A vibration felt in the chest rather than heard with the ears, a sound produced by the enormous volume of wood absorbing force and distributing it through the root system, speaking the wind's language back to itself in a lower register. She had learned, over weeks of sleeping inside it, to read the quality of this sound the way a sailor learns to read the particular motion of a ship in different conditions. The resonance was different tonight, deeper, more sustained, the sound of the tree absorbing something larger than usual. She got up and slipped outside. The sky above the valley was wrong in a way she could feel before she could articulate. The stars she had been using to read the weather, learning their positions and their usual brightness, and the particular atmospheric conditions that affected how they appeared, were obscured, not by visible cloud, but by something higher and thinner. A veil of ice crystals so far up it barely registered as weather. The air was absolutely still. Not the comfortable stillness of a calm, cold night, which has a settled quality, a quality of rest. This was the stillness of held breath, of something large and committed gathering itself. Flint was at her heel. He had not asked to come outside. He had simply appeared there. She looked at the barometer. The needle had moved significantly since morning, more than the previous day, more than the day before that. The rate of change was accelerating. She went back inside. She lay down. She did not sleep. By morning, the confirmation she had been reading toward was complete. The birds were gone, not relocated to better feeding grounds in the gradual way of seasonal movement. Gone in the particular emphatic way of creatures who have received information from the world that the world has not yet transmitted to people, who have simply left completely between one observation and the next, the way a conviction leaves when something has finally made it impossible to hold. Cale noticed before she said anything. "The birds didn't come," he said, standing in the entrance, looking at the too quiet tree line with the focused attention of a child who has learned to trust what he notices. "Mama, the birds didn't come." Flint was pacing, not with distress, but with the focused restlessness of an animal that has received a signal from the world and is waiting for the world to do something about it. He had not eaten his morning food, which had never happened before in all the weeks since he had joined them. She picked up the barometer. She looked at it for a long time. Then she went back to town. This time she did not knock on individual doors. She went directly to the store and walked in without being invited, which in that particular social order was itself a statement. Silas Webb was there again. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has already decided will not change his mind. She told them about the birds. She showed them the barometer. She described the sky, the quality of the air, the behavior of the dog. She told them what her father had written, what he had seen a generation ago, what patterns he had documented, what conclusion he had drawn. She said, anyone who needed shelter should come to the cottonwood. The hollow was warm. It would hold. The silence in the store had a particular texture. She could feel the men deciding something, not deciding whether she was right, but deciding whether to let themselves consider the possibility, which was a different thing and much harder. Then Silas Webb picked up his coffee cup. "The tree woman is afraid of sunshine," he said. He was looking at the other men when he said it, pitched perfectly for the room. The room eased. She looked at Silas Webb for a long moment. She thought of her father, of the community he had warned, of the paragraph at the back of the journal. "They will not listen until the cold proves me right. By then, some will not have the chance to agree." She turned and walked out of the store. She walked back through the settlement, past the houses with their smoking chimneys, past the log structures Silas Webb had built, solid and squared and built on the principle of opposition. She thought, he has built his whole life around that idea. The storm coming did not care about opposition. She walked back to the hollow. She sat down near the fire and looked at Cale and Flint, and the clay-lined walls, and the carefully tended hearth, and the barometer that she set now on the stone ledge where she could see it without reaching. The needle had not stopped moving. The storm came the way her father had described, not gradually, not with the incremental intensification of ordinary bad weather, but like a decision that had been made and was now being executed, a commitment so total that the transition from before to during was less a progression than a threshold cross. The air went from held breath stillness to motion in the space of perhaps an hour. The temperature had already been low. It dropped further now with a speed that the walls of the hollow absorbed and held. The clay lining doing exactly what she had spent weeks engineering it to do, taking the force of the change and distributing it across the enormous thermal mass of the tree's trunk. The mass responding not with immediacy, but with patience, giving back warmth steadily, without drama, at the rate that the situation required, rather than the rate that fear might have demanded. Outside, the wind was not wind in the ordinary sense. It moved over the valley like something with the full weight of physics behind it, pressing against every structure, testing every joint and gap and weakness. Inside the cottonwood, they felt it as sound and vibration. Flint moved to the interior wall and pressed himself against the warm clay with the instinct of an animal that understands shelter in its bones. Cale sat very still with his flat stone in his lap, his eyes wide, listening. Ilara fed the fire, small, deliberate pieces, patient additions at regular intervals, the maintenance of a system that was working and needed only to be sustained. The walls were warm to the touch, had been warm for weeks, the clay having absorbed and stored the warmth of all those carefully tended fires, the warmth radiating back now from every surface with the steady generosity of something that has been given much and returns it freely. Outside, something vast and indifferent and very cold. Inside, the steady, quiet warmth of a space that had been taught, patiently and with great care, how to hold what it had been given. Cale reached over and took her hand. She squeezed it. Once, twice. The same rhythm as the first night, when they had stood outside the house that had never been theirs, and she had known that whatever came next, they would face it together. Outside, the storm committed fully to its direction. And then, in the howling middle of it, came the first knock on the door. She felt it more than heard it. A thudding against the willow and sod door. Irregular, urgent. The knock of someone who has used up most of what they had in getting here and has almost nothing left but the act of knocking. She looked at Cale. He looked back at her with an expression she recognized, the expression of a child who has understood, before he has the words for it, that this is a moment that will define something. She went to the door. The woman who stood outside was Silas Webb's wife. Ilara had seen her at a distance, at the store, at the well, and they had never spoken. She was a thin woman with a practical face and the look of someone who had spent a long time managing things that were difficult to manage. She had 2 small children pressed against her sides, their faces buried in her coat. Her lips had lost most of their color. Her eyelashes were frosted white. She did not speak. She did not apologize or explain or make any kind of case for herself. She simply looked at Ilara with the eyes of someone who has come to the end of every other option and is now here at this door and has nothing left but the hope that it will open. Ilara stepped back from the entrance. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." She said it simply, without drama, without the weight of weeks behind it, without any of the things she could have said and chose not to. There was no triumph in her voice. What she felt was something quieter and older than triumph. The particular feeling of a person who knows they were right, but finds no pleasure in the proof when the proof is standing in front of them with children too cold to cry. They came in. Flint moved to the children immediately. That specific recognition between animals and frightened small people that requires no translation. And pressed himself against the smallest one, who buried her hands in his rough coat without any apparent decision being made. The knocks kept coming, each one different. Each person arrived at that threshold with a different story, a different moment when the cold had finally made the abstract concrete, when what she had said in the store had stopped being the eccentric opinion of a woman in a tree and had become, undeniably, the truth. A miner's family whose ridge beam had failed. The store owner who had burned through a week's fuel in a single night. The young man who had repeated Silas Webb's joke and who had stood outside for nearly a full minute before knocking, using that minute to make his peace with the distance between who he had been that morning and who he was now. She let them all in. She said the same thing to each one. Come in, get warm. Not, I told you so. Not, do you understand now? Just, come in, get warm. And then, very late, after the hollow had arranged itself into something that looked, if you squinted, like a village compressed into the belly of an ancient tree, there was one more knock. Single, heavy. Ilara went to it. She opened the door. Silas Webb stood in the entrance. He was covered in snow in the way that people are covered when they have been outside long enough for the snow to become simply part of the landscape of their experience, no longer registering as something to respond to. His face was raw with cold. His hands were not well. He was not a man who asked for things easily. She could see that in every line of him, in the rigid dignity of a man who had built his identity around being the person others came to. This was the first time in a long time, perhaps ever, that he had come to someone else. He did not knock again. He simply stood. She looked at him. At the man who had named her home Voss's Folly. At the man who had pitched a room against her with 6 well-chosen words. At the man who was standing, right now, inside the evidence of his own error. She stepped back from the entrance. Come in, she said. Get warm. He came in, and Ilara, who had more to say to this man than she had words for, said nothing else, because this was not the moment for it. The moment for it would come. But this moment required something different. The quiet, radical act of treating the people who had failed you as though they were simply people in the cold who needed to come inside. She went to the fire. She added another piece of wood, deliberate, careful, placed for the maximum effect with the minimum waste. The tree held the warmth, the way it had always held it, the way old things hold what they have been given, patiently, without drama, for as long as it is needed. She opened the journal to the last page. She looked at the faces around her in the firelight, at the families and the individuals and the children, and Silas Webb sitting in the corner with the particular stillness of a man who is absorbing something that will take a long time to fully arrive. She began to read. Her father's words, close and economical, every word doing its work. She read about the patterns, about the signs, about what he had seen and documented and understood. She read about the community he had warned a generation ago, and what had happened, and the weight of that knowledge in a man who had survived while others did not. And then she read the last paragraph, the one written at a different time, in slightly different handwriting, by an older man who had had many years to think about what he wanted to say, and had finally found the words. If my daughter finds this, she already knows what to do. She always did. I just needed her to believe it. The hollow was very quiet. Outside, the storm continued its long work on the world. Inside, no one spoke for a moment. Then Silas Webb in the corner looked down at his hands, and the fire burned on. The storm did not relent that night. It continued through the dark hours with the steadiness of something that had committed fully to its course and had no reason to reconsider. Outside, it remade the valley, filling the low places, sculpting the high ones, pressing against every structure with the patient, impersonal force of weather that has no opinion about what it destroys. Inside the cottonwood, 23 people breathed the same warm air. She organized them the way her father's notes had described. Children nearest the fire, the elderly next. Adults arranged in a ring around the perimeter, their backs against the warm clay walls, which had been storing heat for weeks, and gave it back steadily. She moved through the space without stopping. She checked the fire, adding wood in small deliberate amounts. She checked fingers and toes for the whiteness that meant cold had gotten into the blood. She divided the food she had, not as much as she would have liked, but more than she had expected, because Berta had arrived with a cloth bag of dried provisions, handed over with the matter-of-fact air of a person transferring a tool to the person best positioned to use it. Behind Berta, her husband had come in quietly. He did not meet Ilara's eyes, but he was there. He had made his choice when it mattered, and it was the right one. Ilara distributed the food carefully, telling the adults there was more coming when there was not necessarily more coming. Her husband had called this her talent for practical fiction. She had called it motherhood. Both things were true. The man's name was Ned. She had not known his name before tonight. He was perhaps 22, the one who had made the joke in the store. He sat against the wall near the entrance, as though he had not yet decided whether he was allowed to be warm. His hands were in his lap, and the color of them was wrong. She crouched in front of him. "Let me see," she said. He held them out without argument. The fingers were stiff, the skin at the tips the color of old tallow. She pressed gently and watched how slowly the color returned. "I can't feel them properly," he said, quietly, just for her. She got water from the vessel near the hearth, warm, not hot. The instinct to apply heat directly to cold flesh is an instinct that causes damage, and her father's notes had been emphatic about this. The temperature of something living, not something applied. She had him hold his hands in the water while she sat across and watched. After a while, he said, "I said something in the store. I know. I shouldn't have." She watched the color return slowly to his fingertips. "No," she said, "you shouldn't have." He looked at the floor. "I owe you an apology. A proper one. Not just..." He gestured at the space around him, at his presence here, the implicit admission of everything. "You don't have to do it tonight," she said. "Tonight, you just have to stay warm." He looked up at her with the expression of someone who has been expecting something harder than what they received. She moved on. There was always someone else who needed something. Cale was sitting with two of the smallest children, showing them something on his flat stone. Letters scratched in clay dust, saying their names in a low voice, while the children leaned in with the focus of small people who have decided they want to understand something. He had not been asked to do this. He had simply assessed the space and found where he could be useful and done the useful thing. She watched him for a moment longer than she needed to, then looked away because her eyes had started doing something she did not have time for. She went back to the fire. It was Silas Webb who found the rest of the journal. She had left it open on the stone ledge. At some point in the long hours of the night, he had picked it up. She noticed when she passed him the second or third time, the big man sitting in his corner, reading, his brow furrowed. The face of a man engaged with something that is causing him discomfort. Not because the material is difficult, but because of what it reveals. She did not interrupt him. Sometime in the deep middle of the night, Flint got up from where he had been lying against Cale, both of them breathing in the synchronized way that children and animals achieve when they have decided to trust each other completely, and crossed the hollow to a woman in the far corner. Her name was Marin. She was one of the miners' wives, perhaps 35, a woman who had settled her children and then settled herself into the particular quietness of someone who has spent so long putting others first that receiving has become foreign to her. She was not sleeping. Flint lay down beside her and put his head in her lap. Her hand came up slowly and rested on his head. Then something in her face shifted. Not dramatically, just a small private shift. The kind that happens when the last thing holding something together is touched gently enough that it can finally let go. She put her face in her free hand. She did not make a sound, but her shoulders moved. Ilara saw it. She did not go to the woman. She simply kept her eyes available in case Marin looked up and needed to find someone looking back without judgment. After a while, Marin looked up. Their eyes met. Ilara nodded once, very slightly. Marin looked back down at Flint. After a time, her breathing slowed. She slept. Cale woke in the darkest hour. He got up carefully, stepping over and around the sleeping forms with the precision of a child who has learned not to disturb things unnecessarily, and came and sat beside her at the fire. After a while, he said, "Are they going to be all right? All of them?" She thought about what honesty required here, and about what her responsibility to him required, and about how those two requirements sometimes pointed in different directions. "Most of them," she said. "Yes." He was quiet. "But not all of them." "The world doesn't work in all," she said. "It works in most, and we do what we can with the rest." He thought about this for a long time, his elbows on his knees, his eyes on the fire. "Papa would have liked this," he said. "What you built." She looked at the boy beside her, at his deliberate young face, his father's jaw, her father's eyes. "Yes," she said, "he would have." Cale leaned against her side, the way he had always leaned since before he could stand on his own. She put her arm around him. They sat like that until he fell asleep again, and she eased him down and stayed where she was, watching the fire, listening to the storm's long work outside and the breathing of the people who had come inside. It was Callum who woke her. The quality of the light had changed. Not the absolute black of storm middle, but something grayer, something that carried, however faintly, the suggestion of the world reconsidering. "The wind's changing," Callum said quietly. She listened. He was right. The focused directionality of the storm's peak hours had given way to something more variable. The storm had not stopped, but it had passed its center. She got up and fed the fire. Callum helped her. He had been watching, she realized, long enough to understand the rhythm of it. He added pieces at slightly wrong angles, slightly too large. But his hands had the quality of hands that know how to learn. She showed him without making it a lesson, the way her father had always taught, by doing the right thing in front of someone and trusting them to notice. He noticed. They tended the fire together in the quiet gray hour before the others woke. After a while, he said, "How did you know about the storm?" "The barometer," she said, "and the birds." and the way the air felt. But you could have been wrong. Yes? So why did you go to them? She looked at the fire. Because my father warned a community once, and not enough of them listened. He wrote about it for the rest of his life, with regret, that he hadn't tried harder. He left me everything I needed to survive a storm, she said, but the last thing he wanted was for me to survive it alone. Callum placed the next piece of wood the way she had shown him. The fire accepted it. It was Silas Webb who spoke first when the others began to wake. He had finished the journal some hours ago and set it back on the ledge with the deliberateness of someone returning something to its rightful place. The children woke first, as children do. Cale's flat stone appeared, and 3 children were examining it before most of the adults had finished orienting themselves. Flint moved through the waking bodies, performing his morning round. The miner's oldest daughter, 14, who had carried her sibling through the storm, sat up and looked at Cale and his stone. "Can you teach me too?" she said. "The letters." Cale looked at her with the assessment of someone taking a request genuinely. "Yes," he said, "sit here." And then, without fanfare, in the belly of an ancient tree, in the tail end of a storm, a child began to teach other children to read. Ilara stood at the edge of this and felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly. Happiness seemed too simple for what this was. Something heavier. Something earned. It was Silas Webb's voice that pulled her attention away. He spoke to the whole room, to the gathering of people who represented the community that had assembled around her over the past months, like a verdict being slowly rendered. His voice was the same voice he always used. Large, certain, accustomed to rooms. But something in it had changed. The certainty was still there. It was a different kind now. The certainty of a man who was considered being wrong and arrived on the other side of that consideration. "I have been building wrong," he said, "for 30 years. The room was quiet. Not wrong in the sense of, the structures are standing. They're standing. But standing isn't the same as right. I've been building walls to fight the cold, and the cold always wins in the end. You can't fight it. You can only understand it, and build with that understanding instead of against it." He looked at Ilara. His face was not a face that had ever practiced humility and could not quite produce it on short notice. But it held something that would eventually become humility, given time and practice. "The man who wrote that journal worked this out a generation ago," he said, "and his daughter built it here. And I stood in her valley and called it folly." The room was very still. "I was wrong," he said. He said it to the room, but he was looking at Ilara. She held his gaze. She thought about the weeks of cold, about Cale's face when the boy at the well had said Voss's folly with borrowed cruelty, about the letter she had written and burned, about her father, who had lived his whole life with the weight of not having tried harder. "Now you know more," she said. "What you do with it is what matters." He nodded once, a single, deliberate nod. The kind that means a thing has been decided. She turned back to the fire. Behind her, the sound of children learning letters continued against the backdrop of a storm that was already, slowly, choosing to become something the world could live with again. In the late afternoon of the storm's second day, Maren Wren went into labor. It was not expected. Her time was still weeks away. But the body has its own accounting, and a woman who has walked through a storm carrying children and provisions, and the specific terror of a night when the roof becomes unreliable, will sometimes decide that certain things cannot wait. Ilara had not delivered a child before, but her father had written about it. There were notes, careful and spare, about cold weather deliveries, what to watch for, what to do, what not to do, written in the practical, unfrightened tone of a man who has learned that most things, approached with steadiness, are more manageable than fear suggests. She sent Callum outside with the older children and Cale. She asked Berta to stay. Berta had already positioned herself near Marin with the economy of a woman who has been present at this event before. The birth took several hours. There were moments that required steadiness that Ilara produced by thinking only about the next 3 minutes, not the hour beyond them, by thinking about her father's handwriting, by thinking about the clay walls warm against her back. The child arrived in the early evening, small, vocal, entirely displeased with the sudden change in her circumstances, and entirely healthy. Marin held her and looked at her with the expression that belongs only to that specific moment. Something beyond love, something that predates language. Hope, Marin said, not asking, knowing. Because what else would you call a child born in the heart of a storm, inside the hollow of a tree that everyone had called worthless, delivered by a woman they had called a fool? Hope? The word moved through the hollow quietly, passed from mouth to mouth. Berta said it, and her voice was unsteady for the first time Ilara had ever heard. Ned said it from his corner, where his hands were warmer now and his face had the open expression of someone being remade by events. Silas Webb said nothing, but Ilara, passing him with a basin of warm water, looked at his face. He was looking at the child, and on the face of a man who had spent 30 years building walls to fight the cold, there was the expression of someone understanding, for the first time and all at once, what they had been building for. Not the walls, not the structures. This continuation, this answer to the storm. She set down the basin. She went to where Cale had come back inside and was sitting near the entrance. She sat beside him. "There's a baby," she said. He already knew. He looked at her with his father's eyes and her father's steadiness. "Is she all right?" he said. "She's perfect," Ilara said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The earth never forgets what it has been taught." She looked at him. He was looking at the fire, turning the phrase over, testing it. "You say it sometimes," he said, "when something works out. I've been trying to understand what it means." She looked at the room, at the sleeping families and the waking children, at the woman holding her new daughter in the clay-lined warmth of an ancient tree, at Silas Webb with the face of someone being educated, at Berta, who had appeared with provisions and the muscle memory of survival, at Callum, placing wood exactly as she had shown him, at Cale, beside her, asking the right questions. "It means," she said, "that nothing your grandfather taught me was ever lost. Even when I forgot it. Even when I didn't know I needed it." She paused. "And nothing I teach you will be lost either. Even long after I'm gone." He thought about this. Then he leaned against her side, the way he had always leaned. Outside, the storm continued its slow retreat. Inside, the fire burned low and steady. The walls gave back their warmth. And a new person breathed her first full night of air in a hollow that everyone had once agreed was worthless. The storm ended the way great things end, not with drama, but with a gradual, almost apologetic withdrawal, as though the world were embarrassed by what it had done and was quietly trying to put things back in order. The wind dropped first. Then the temperature began its slow climb back towards something livable. The light that came through the entrance gap on the morning of the third day carried, however faintly, the quality of light that follows destruction, the light of a world that has been scoured clean and is beginning, cautiously, to consider what comes next. Ilara stood at the entrance of the hollow and looked at the valley. It had been remade. The drifts were enormous, sculpted into shapes that bore no resemblance to the landscape she had learned over the preceding weeks. Familiar landmarks were transformed. Trees she had used for navigation were buried to their lower branches. The path to the stream was invisible beneath a surface of white that looked smooth and innocent and was neither, but the cottonwood stood, unchanged, unmoved. Its massive trunk rising from the snow like something that had decided, before the storm existed, that it would still be standing after. She pressed her hand against the bark, still warm on the leeward side, where the clay-packed interior had been radiating steadily for days. The tree had done what it had always done. It had held. Behind her, people were beginning to move. The sounds of a communal mourning, children waking, low voices, the shuffle of people finding their feet after too long on the floor. She heard Cale's voice among them, patient and clear, something about letters and the flat stone. She breathed the cold morning air. She thought about what came next. They emerged in stages throughout the morning, blinking into the flat white light of the aftermath, taking stock of what the storm had done. The damage was significant. 2 rooftops had failed, enough to make the structures uninhabitable without repair. Several chimney stacks had come apart, leaving houses cold. Fences were gone. Outbuildings were buried. The general store had lost its front awning. The people walked through this with the careful, assessing silence of those calculating the work ahead. Ilara walked with them. The news about old Haskell reached them mid-morning. He was found in his house, the small, solid house he had maintained alone for more years than most people in the valley could remember. He had not wanted help. He had never wanted help. He had turned away every person who had knocked on his door, including 2 who had come specifically to invite him to the hollow. He had refused. He had always refused. He was found peacefully in his chair by the hearth, as though he had simply decided to sit down and wait for whatever came next. She stood outside his house for a moment when she heard. She thought, "This is the weight my father carried. This is what it feels like to warn and to open the door and to have it matter to everyone except the one person you most wanted to reach." She did not feel anger. She felt the specific sadness of an outcome that was always possible, and that no amount of doing the right thing could have made impossible. Some people make their choices and hold them to the end. Not a comfortable truth, but a real one. She said a quiet thing to the cold air above his door, something between a goodbye and an acknowledgement, and she moved on. The other death was harder. Inspector Grady's granddaughter, 5 years old, found with the family in their house, which had held structurally but had not held warmth. The family had stayed because Grady had believed, with the conviction of a man whose authority had never been seriously challenged, that his house would be sufficient. It had been sufficient for every winter he had known. This winter had not consulted his record. The child was gone before anyone could reach them. Ilara heard this and stood very still in the middle of the ruined street. Cale was beside her. He had been beside her all morning. Present, moving through the aftermath with the attention of a child who has understood that this day requires something different from him than ordinary days. "Mama," he said. She looked at him. His face was working through the arithmetic of a world where people who might have been saved were not saved. "We opened the door," he said, "for everyone who knocked." "Yes, but not everyone knocked." "No." He was quiet. "Is that our fault?" She crouched down to his level. "We cannot save people from their own choices." she said. "We can only make sure the door is open. What someone does when they reach it, that belongs to them." He looked at the ground between them. "I don't like that," he said. "Neither do I," she said. "That's what tells you it matters." He thought about this. Then he straightened in the way he had been straightening all season, a fraction at a time, each small increment so gradual she almost missed it until she looked at him and saw someone she hadn't quite noticed becoming. "Then let's go help," he said. The reckoning with Silas Webb happened 2 days after the storm ended. He came to the hollow at dawn, alone, without the coffee cup, without the audience, without the settled confidence of a man who knows the room will arrange itself around him. He came with her father's journal. He set it on the stone ledge where she kept the barometer, with the same careful deliberateness with which he had replaced it the night of the storm. "I've been thinking," he said. She waited. "The design in the back. The adaptation for conventional construction." He looked at his hands. The big, skilled, calloused hands of a man who had spent his life making things. "It works. I've been thinking through the mechanics of it for 2 days. It works with what we already build. The frames, the materials. It requires adjustment, not reinvention. A man who knew what he was doing could implement it without tearing down what already exists." He looked up at her. "I want to build it for the town," he said. "Every structure that needs it, starting with the ones that failed." She looked at him. "The houses that need repair first," she said. "Not because it proves the principle, because people need to be warm." "Yes." "And you teach them why it works. Not just how, why." He paused at this, the slight hesitation of a man who has spent his life demonstrating competence and is less accustomed to explaining the reasoning behind it. "Yes," he said. She thought about the morning in the general store, about the ease with which he had closed a room against her, and the cost of what that ease had purchased. "When you stand in front of them," she said, "tell them you were wrong. Not once. Every time someone new asks where this came from." He was quiet for a long moment. "That's a hard thing to ask." "I know," she said. "It's necessary anyway." Another silence. "All right," he said. He held out his hand. She looked at it. She thought about the weeks of cold, and the name he had given her home, and the particular ease with which he had dismissed what she knew. She thought about her father, who had carried the weight of not trying hard enough. She thought about a small, loud child named Hope, breathing in the hollow behind her. She took his hand. Harlan came on a morning shortly after. She saw him crossing the valley from a distance. His particular walk, the walk of a man who moves through the world as though it owes him an unobstructed path. She waited. He stopped at the edge of the cleared space around the cottonwood and looked up at the tree the way a man looks at something he is trying to find the flaw in and cannot quite locate. Then he looked at her. "The work will go on," he said. "It always does." His voice was the same voice. No cruelty, no pleasure. The flat, final sound of a man who has looked at the world and found it to be exactly what he expected. A place where what he does will continue to be necessary, and nothing that happens will require him to reconsider his fundamental understanding of things. He was not asking for anything. He was not apologizing. He was simply noting, with the precision of an accountant closing a column, that the ledger he operated by remained unchanged. Ilara looked at him. She had thought in the weeks before the storm that she wanted something from this man, a reckoning, an acknowledgement. She found, standing in the aftermath, that she did not want it anymore. What he thought of her had lost its weight. "Then go," she said. He looked at her for a moment. He turned and walked back across the valley. She watched him until he was gone. Not because she needed to see him leave, because she wanted to know precisely the moment when he was no longer there, so that she could mark it, so that she could stand in the space after it and feel what it was. The end of something that had too long had power over her. She turned back to her home. Callum's legal work concluded on a morning of pale winter sun when the world had moved far enough past the storm to be beginning to think about spring. He brought the documentation to the hollow without ceremony and explained in his precise and practical way that the land surrounding the cottonwood tree was now, by proper legal recognition, hers. Cale was present. He listened to the explanation with his characteristic attention, asking one or two questions that were more precise than Alara had expected. Questions that told her he had been thinking about this matter for some time and had developed his own views on it. Afterward, when Callum had finished and the papers were on the ledge beside the barometer and the journal, Cale looked at Alara. "It was always ours," he said. "Yes," she said. "Now it's just official." "Now it's just official?" He nodded, with the air of someone confirming something they already knew, but had been waiting for the world to catch up to. Then he went back to his lessons. Callum stayed. He had been staying more often, in the week since the storm. The way people stay when a place has become somewhere they want to be, and when the person in that place has become someone they want to be near. He said one evening, when Cale was asleep, and the fire was low, and the tree was doing its long, slow breathing around them, "I don't need you to need me." She was looking at the fire. "I know," she said. "I just want to be here," he said, "if you'll have me." Outside, the wind moved around the cottonwood in its old familiar way, patient, unhurried. The sound of something that knows it has time. "Yes," she said. It was the yes of a woman who has been alone long enough to know the difference between needing company and choosing it. The yes of someone who has built her home with her own hands and knows, therefore, exactly what she is offering when she opens the door. Cale, who was not quite as asleep as he appeared, reached over and put his hand on Flint's back. Flint's tail moved once. The seasons turned. Spring came, and with it the slow revelation of a valley reshaped by what had passed through it. New contours in the land, new openings in the tree line, grass pushing through the last of the snow, the first birds returning, cautious, and then less cautious. Silas Webb built through the spring. He built as he had always built, with skill and speed and the authority of a man who is entirely in his element. But he built differently now. He explained as he worked, which was not something he had done before. He said, "This wall is not a barrier, it is a vessel." He said, "We are not fighting the cold, we are storing warmth." He said these things not once but repeatedly, to every person who came to watch, to every family whose house he was repairing or improving. He said, when asked where he had learned this, "From a woman I called a fool." He said it every time. Ilara heard it second-hand, from Berta, who had resumed her visits and brought with her sometimes other women. Women who had questions about the hollow, about the building techniques, about what else her father's journal contained. She answered every question. She found in the teaching that the knowledge deepened. Explaining something to another person required her to understand it more fully than simply doing it had. Her father had known this. The lesson was always reaching forward, across time, toward whoever would need it next. The seasons that followed were quieter than the one before them, as seasons often are after something large has passed through and rearranged what people thought was permanent. The valley learned new ways to stay warm. Ilara taught. Callum stayed. Kale grew. And Flint simply continued being exactly what he had always been until one morning in late autumn when he was not. He did not die dramatically. He had been slower for some months, sleeping more, eating less, moving through the hollow with the careful economy of a creature conserving what it has. He had not stopped following Kale. He had not stopped appearing wherever warmth was greatest. He had simply, gradually, reduced his requirements, as though he understood that the time for great effort had passed and the time for rest had come, and had made his peace with the transition in the way that animals sometimes do, quietly and without fuss. He died in the night, in the spot he always chose, pressed against the warm clay wall near the fire's stone base, in the exact place that caught the best of the radiant heat. He was at the end warm. Kale found him in the morning. He sat beside Flint for a long time without speaking, his hand resting on the still rough coat, and the hollow was quiet around him. Ilara did not tell him to come away. She did not offer words immediately. She let him have what he needed to have, for as long as he needed to have it, because grief, even the grief of a child for an animal, is not something to be managed away, but something to be sat with until it has said what it came to say. After a while, Kale looked up. He was never lost, he said. Was he? He just didn't have anyone yet. No, she said, he was never lost. They buried him at the base of the cottonwood, on the south side where the sun reached longest, where the ground was softest and most willing to receive. Callum helped dig. Berta came without being asked and stood without being asked to stand, because that was what Berta did. She appeared where she was needed and remained until she was no longer needed, and then she went, without ceremony, the way she had always gone. Kale chose the stone himself from the stream bed, taking a long time, testing several before settling on one that was the right shape and the right weight, and had the right quality of surface for what he intended. He carved the words himself, slowly, with the knife Ilara had taught him to use. He was never lost. He was always home. They stood in the pale autumn light, the four of them, and said goodbye to the fifth, who had been the first to believe the hollow was worth believing in. Years moved through the valley the way years do, not dramatically, but accumulatively, each one leaving something behind and taking something away. Kale grew into someone Ilara recognized, not in appearance but in quality, the careful attention to things, the patience with people who didn't immediately understand. He left the valley eventually, drawn toward work that had something to do with the law and a great deal to do with the injustices visited upon people who had no one to argue their case. He wrote when he could. The letters were long and specific and sometimes funny and always honest. She read them by firelight, which she still preferred to anything else, even now. Hope Wren grew up in the valley. She became someone who watched the sky the way Ilara had watched the walls, with the patient attention of a person who understands that the world is always telling you something. She kept careful records in notebooks next to a copy of Edmund Voss's journal that Ilara had made for her by hand, page by careful page. When people asked Hope where her knowledge came from, she said, "From a woman who learned it from her father, who learned it from the land itself. The knowledge passed through the particular, irreplaceable transmission of one person caring enough to teach another, not because they were required to, not because they were paid to, because they understood that what they carried was not theirs alone, and that carrying it alone was a kind of waste. The earth never forgets what it has been taught. The final scene unfolded on a still afternoon many years later, when the light had that quality that light achieves in the late seasons: golden, horizontal, without urgency, the light of something that knows the day is long enough and is not in any hurry to spend what remains. Ilara sat at the entrance of the hollow. She sat in the chair that Callum had made for her, years ago now, from wood he had chosen carefully, jointed in a way that accounted for the particular angle at which she liked to sit and watch the valley, which he had noticed without being told. Because noticing things about the people you love without being told is a form of attention that is also a form of respect. The chair had been used so long, it had shaped itself to her in the way that good things shape themselves to the people who use them. Her granddaughter sat beside her. She was 7, Cale's daughter, brought to visit for the season, brought to the hollow that she had heard about all her life, in the way that children hear about places that are part of their story before they are old enough to visit them. She had walked through the entrance with wide eyes and said nothing for a long time, which was exactly the right response. Some things require silence before they can be spoken about. She had been asking questions ever since, the way this particular child always asked questions, thoroughly, from multiple angles, returning to the same question from different approaches until she felt she had understood it adequately. "Grandma," she said now, in the particular tone of a child who has been working up to something and has finally decided that the moment is right. "Were you ever scared when you came here the first time?" The valley lay below them, unchanged in its essential nature, if not in its particulars. More houses now than there had been. Different people in some of them. The same cold coming, as it always came, and the same preparation required, as it always had been required, season after season, year after year, generation after generation. Ilara looked at the valley for a moment before she answered. She let the question settle. She thought about what an honest answer looked like. Not the answer that would be encouraging, or the answer that would be comforting, but the answer that was true. "Every single day," she said. "Every day for a very long time." The girl considered this. "But you stayed." "I stayed." "Why?" Ilara looked at the bark of the cottonwood, at the initials carved by her father's hand, which she could not see from here but knew were there, worn smooth by years and the slight dampness of the living wood, more familiar to her now than almost anything in the world. At the inscription on the stone at the base of the tree, which she could see, "He was never lost. He was always home." At the valley below, where Silas Webb had taught the method her father developed to every person who asked, and where those people had taught their neighbors, and where the knowledge had moved outward in the way that useful things move. Not through proclamation, but through use, through the ordinary daily practice of people who had found that something worked and continued to do it. "Because fear didn't get to make the choices," she said. "I did." The girl was quiet, turning this over with the thoroughness of a child who takes ideas seriously. "Will you teach me?" she said. "What great-grandfather taught you?" Ilara looked at her, at the careful eyes, at the hands folded in her lap, with a patience that was unmistakably familiar, at the quality of attention in her face, the quality of someone who is actually listening, which is rarer and more valuable than most people understand. She thought about her father, who had pressed his palm to the bark of this tree in a winter she had not yet been born to witness, who had scratched his initials into the interior wall and left a letter in a tin box and trusted that whoever needed to find it would. She thought about Cale, who had carried a flat stone through a winter that would have flattened many adults, who had said for my lessons and meant it. She thought about Hope Wren, keeping her notebooks, making her records, passing on what she had been given. She thought about the fire burning low in the hollow behind her. Yes, she said, everything. The words settled between them like a stone placed carefully, like clay pressed firmly into a wall, like a fire tended with the understanding that it needs to last the night. Not the dramatic gesture, not the large addition that flares and subsides, but the steady, patient, consistent attention that keeps something burning long after the easy fuel is gone. The earth never forgets what it has been taught. The valley held the last of the light. The old tree breathed. And inside the hollow, warm as it had always been, the fire burned low and steady, patient and unhurried, the way it had burned on the first night a woman had chosen this place as her home. Not because it was easy, not because anyone told her she was right to choose it, but because she had looked at the darkness inside the ancient tree and recognized in it something she already knew how to fill. If your own storm is coming, and it will come, storms always do, remember her. Remember that you do not have to fight the cold. You only have to understand it. The knowledge is already inside you. Someone who loved you put it there.